Day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Dremio Partner Webinar Series. I'm super excited to have you all here today, and I'm super excited about our topic, and I hope you are as well. Today, we're going to talk about how you can centralize your data security and your governance with your open data lakehouse with Dremio and Privacera. My name is Brett Roberts, and I am the Partner Solutions Architect here at Dremio, and I manage our relationship with Privacera. And with me today, I am super excited to have Lovesh from Privacera join me. Lovesh, thanks for joining, and why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Brett. I'm Lovesh Chavla, Director of Sales Engineering at Privacera. I lead our sales engineering team here. Thank you for having us on the webinar today.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for your partnership. We're super excited about what we've done together as partners and what we're continuing to do. So thank you so much. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this. And we're going to start with talking about how organizations are continuously moving to becoming more data-driven. It's kind of the genesis for this conversation today. And we're seeing an exponential growth in how businesses are adopting and embracing this data-driven culture. And by doing this, which is super positive, but it's having some impacts on the data teams that are supporting the business. And when we think about what it takes to become data-driven for an organization, the first thing is that you need to have massive amounts of data of different sources, different varieties and types in order to create those descriptive, diagnostic, and proactive analytics. And you need to be able to retain that data for a lot longer as well. So data teams are having to ingest more data from different sources, different varieties, and then retain that a lot longer. As data-driven organizations empower lines of business, users, end users to leverage data to make those data-driven decisions, data teams have seen a monumental increase in data access requests as well. And both of these things really add to an increase, or have created an increased complexity and cost for data architectures. And really what we're going to talk about today more than anything else is the challenge that data teams are facing in ensuring enterprise level access controls, governance, and security to handle the growth of data, but really also the monumental growth of users that are trying to access the data. And we think about the scale of what organizations are facing today and how organizations have traditionally built data architectures to handle, data requests. For the last, few years now, organizations have really embraced this two-tier approach where they are using data lake to ingest data, and the data lake has kind of become that de facto landing spot for a lot of the data out there. But then in order to get the data into the hands of the data consumers, right, the end users that are making those data-driven decisions, data teams have been forced to create these brittle and complex pipelines to move the data into data warehouses, cloud data warehouses. And then even then, in order to satisfy the needs of the end users, we see a lot of organizations have to create extracts and cubes and reports to get the data into the data consumers to actually create those analytics and reports. And I read an article that the average data set is copied 9 times in this architecture, which, again, when we think about from a governance and security standpoint alone, that's super challenging and super scary. But when you factor in the exponential growth of access requests and amount of data, data teams are finding that this type of traditional architecture, this two-tier approach, is becoming very challenging, complex, and costly. And so what organizations are looking for is a new modern data architecture to handle the growth of data, the data requests, all and support that data-driven culture for the organization. And the Lakehouse is becoming more and more of a popular data architecture. And I think over the last year, it's becoming more and more, popular of a term as the industry is embracing the Lakehouse and as organizations are starting to adopt this as their architecture. What a Lakehouse is, for those of you who aren't familiar, is it's really taking the best of the data warehouse and the best of the data lake and combining it into one unified data architecture where you have the ability to have data quality and data consistency and ACID transactions from the data warehouse with the scalability, the flexibility, and the cost of the data lake. So that's kind of the data lakehouse. And in this architecture, what you see here on this slide is that data is coming from a variety of different sources that are supporting the business, and it's being landed into that data lake storage. But how it's represented in the data lake storage and what makes it an open data lakehouse is that it's represented in open file and table formats like Parquet for your files or Iceberg table format. And that actually allows organizations to take some of the features of the data warehouse, like being able to do DML, time travel, and versioning. Iceberg allows you to do that directly on the data lake. So the data is sitting in the data lake in open table and file formats. And then you have your query engine or query engines that directly connect to the data on the data lake and provide querying in place. And this is where Dremio comes in, because Dremio provides that query engine capability where you can query data directly on the data lake. You have performance that's fast enough for BI. And then we also offer a unified semantic layer that allows not just the data teams, but also those data consumers that are becoming more and more data driven to interact with data directly on the lake, find the data sets that they need and that they need for their reporting and their analytics, and then directly connect those to their BI and data science tools of choice. And as we talk about, the importance of security and supporting this, as Lovelace talks about that in a few minutes, when you have data consumers also trying to interact with data sets directly on the lake, access controls and access policies, security and governance are critical for that. And so when we look at ensuring access controls, governance, and security, this is really where this conversation, what Lovelace is going to be talking about today. And this is really the genesis for the partnership between Dremio and Privacera, where our goal is to help ensure and provide enterprise governance and access controls to this open data lakehouse to allow data teams to be able to support the growing amount of end users that are accessing data and the growing amount of data while still ensuring enterprise governance and security. So just really setting the table here, I'm going to hand it over to Lovelace to kind of dive into what Privacera is doing to support this and how Privacera is working with Dremio. So Lovelace, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks again, Brett. So as you very rightly mentioned, right, a lot of the companies are moving towards being more data-driven, right? And one of the challenges that we see with these companies is that they have a high level of friction to balance what we call the data democratization with compliance. So if you see in this diagram here, on the left-hand side, you have these data policy drivers, right? So those are your privacy, security, and governance people who are basically defining the policies on these data sets, right? So if you have certain sensitive data, who within the company should be able to view those data, right? And then on the right-hand side, you have the data consumers, right? So these are usually the business units or the analytics team who are trying to drive insights from these data sets to make better educated business decisions, right? So you have your sales teams, marketing team, right? And then there's usually a friction in between because the data consumer wants their data set as soon as it lands, right? So they want to be able to access it right away. Whereas the policy drivers wants to make sure that the team do not have access to the data set where there may be some sensitive information, right? So this kind of creates the friction. And a lot of times this slows down the process of the data getting onboarded to the first time a user is able to access a query or access that data set, right? So this is where Privacera comes in. We really simplify this process and we work across a lot of data services, including Dremio, to provide that data governance and security to where the enterprises do not have to do it as silos across all of these data services. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the value that we have seen with a lot of our customers. So after onboarding Privacera, their increase in the data usage goes up by 6 times, and their time to onboard a new data set reduces by 95%. So I worked with a big apparel company in US. Before they onboarded Privacera, it would take them about 3 weeks from 3 weeks to onboard a new data set. So from the time the data landed, a new data landed to the time the user was able to query that data, it was about 3 weeks. And now they're able to do that within a day with Privacera coming in. So it really reduced that time to onboard new data set and onboard new users. Next slide, please. So going a little bit in the architecture and how we're able to provide that value, right? So Privacera is a platform that comes in 3 different modules. We have discovery and classification module. So this allows you to scan and tag data. So you can basically scan your data sources and identify PII data, for example, email addresses, person's name, social security number, credit card. And then you can use the centralized access management module to be able to define policies where you can do fine-grained access control, right? So which teams are able to view this data? If you want to mask specific columns, you're able to define those policies. If you want to filter out certain data sets, so for example, my marketing team should only be able to see certain rows versus my sales team, or a team depending on their location. So my US team should only be able to see the US data versus my UK team should see the UK data, right? So you can basically define those access control policies and get those enforced. And then the third is encryption and masking. So this is where, for more security restricted use cases where the masking on fly isn't sufficient, we do provide column level encryption, right? So if you have identified, for example, social security number, and you want to encrypt just that specific column in the table, you can use our encryption and masking module to just encrypt that column. All of this is being powered by Apache Ranger underneath. So Privacera is based on open source and open standards. And then all the services that Privacera is managing, we provide real-time monitoring and alerts. So you can basically see the users who queried that data. And in terms of the deployment model, we offer both customer managed and our task model. So in the customer managed, we do allow where the customer can install it, our platform in their VPC, or we have a SaaS offering where they can integrate their data services with our SaaS offering, and they can basically create the policies and get started right away. And they don't have to worry about the architecture design, patching, upgrading, HA, anything like that. Just like any SaaS service, we take care of all of those things for them. Next slide, please. So this just kind of shows the breadth of the connectors, what we call like the data services that we support. So we support over 50 different connectors across all public clouds, on-prem, and partner services on these cloud providers like Dremio. Next slide, please. So just share the story of the better together, right? So there are definitely things that you get in terms of the fine-grained access control and out-of-the-box integration that you get out of the box with Dremio. However, with Privacera and Dremio, we really simplify that. And on top of that, we provide auditing and reporting, and then being able to discovery and do classification, and then also be able to do attribute-based access control, which is really powerful. And I'll show that on the demo here in a minute. So you get a lot more additional features that you do not get with just Dremio or with open source Ranger, right? So for companies or folks out there who are using Apache Ranger for doing access control on Dremio, it doesn't provide the fine-grained access control. So you can basically create policies and manage access at a table level, but it doesn't give you further kind of column masking or filtering at a row. So it doesn't give you those fine-grained access control that are usually the key use cases for compliance controls. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of walk through the architecture of how Privacera does the policy authoring and policy enforcement, right? So one thing that distinguishes Privacera from other solutions that do similar things is basically we are really a lightweight plugin solution. What do I mean by that is, if you think of a security or a governance policy, you have kind of two layers to it. You have a policy authoring layer, and then you have the policy enforcement layer. So Privacera acts as the policy authoring layer, where you're going in Privacera to be able to define these policies. And it gives you that unified layer where you are defining policies for all your services within Privacera. But the enforcement happens within the data service itself, right? So what Privacera does is it translates those policies into the underlying data service and push that policy into the underlying layer. So for example, in this case, in Dremio, it provides great performance, right? So since you are doing the enforcement at the data service layer itself, Privacera is not kind of acting a layer to provide that security and governance. So you don't have to compromise on performance when you're trying to implement security. The second is, let's say for whatever reason, even if your whole Privacera system was to go down completely, your security is still enforced because they are being enforced by the. So to go a level deeper into this, if you look at my architecture diagram here, you have the Privacera admin portal, and this is where you're able to define the policies. And this is where you already have your kind of tags that Privacera is able to scan and identify on your data sources. So you have all of those informations in Privacera. And then we get all the users, groups, and roles that are in Dremio. We get all the metadata, and we get all the privileges that are there. And then our policy sync engine is what we call it, is able to compute that delta, right? So I have the policies that are sitting in here on Privacera, and then I have policies that are there in Dremio. And then whatever the delta is, it will basically push those changes, right? So it does that, and you can basically configure Privacera to be able to do that, how often you want to push those policies. Next slide, please. So what I'll do here now, I'll demonstrate the solution, and I'll switch to our demo. So going into the demo, I am logged into the Privacera SaaS portal. I'm on the dashboard as logged in myself. You can see on the dashboard, I can see information such as how many, excuse me, how many users and groups are being managed by Privacera. What are the various services that are being managed, the different kind of policies that are there. So we have policies that are defined on a resource. We have attribute-based policies, and then fine-grained access control policies, for example, masking a sensitive column or filtering out certain rows. I can then further see the various policies that are there. So to go into what a policy or defined policy looks like, I'll go into our resource policies. In here, you can see all the different connectors that Privacera supports. Right? So I'll go into our Dremio connector. So let's take a look at a sample access policy. So I'll go in here on policy number 243. And you can see in the kind of the top section of the policy details, you define what you're giving access to. So you can basically, in here, I'm giving access to all the sources and then all the physical data set and columns within that source. You could also define a policy based on the space rather than on the source, and then you can choose the space and the virtual data set. At the bottom, you define kind of who you're giving access to. So you can give access to a user or at a group level. These users and groups are synced from Active Directory. And then you can choose the specific permissions you want to give, right? So I can basically just give select permission. So that way they don't have any altered privileges. So I have these access permissions that are there. Now, what I'll do is I'll go into the Dremio query side and kind of show you how I'm able to access the data set since I have these access policies defined. So I am logged in as myself here on the Dremio UI, and I'll go ahead and run this query. And you can see I'm able to query the sales data here. I'll go ahead on the second tab, and I'm logged in as Jason Payne in here as another user. And I'll go ahead and run the query. And again, Jason is able to see the data too, right? So let me kind of now showcase some of the fine-grained access control policies. So the first one I'd like to show is how I can mask certain sensitive column. So let's look at the policy 247 here. you can see the red dot in front of both the policies. What that indicates is basically that the policy is authored, but it's not being enforced. So when I look at the policy 247, you can see the policy is disabled. And what it's doing is it's masking the name column. So in that sales data table or that data set, the name column is being masked. I'll go ahead and enable that policy. And what is happening is for user Lovelace, I'll basically go ahead and hash that column. And then for JSON, I'll nullify it. You have various options out of the bat, so you can basically hash it or nullify it. You can also do partial mask, for example, for account numbers or social security number. You can do a partial mask and just show the last four or first four, or you can basically use a custom function to mask these. All right. So I'll go ahead and save this. Now, when I do save it, that red dot becomes to blue, so the policy is enabled. And what is happening is that we are basically pushing this policy in real time into Dremio. So if I go in our audit logs, you can see the timestamp of right now when I'm recording this demo. And this policy was pushed where a function was created to mask that, and it was applied natively to Dremio, right? So now if I actually go back to my query, so if I run the query as myself, you can see that name column get hashed. And if I go in Jason's tab, you can see he was able to see the name earlier. If I run the query on the same data, now the column is nullified, right? So it's nullified for Jason and it's hashed for myself. The second thing that I want to show is the row level filter, right? So what I want to demonstrate here is filtering it based on user attributes. So let's go ahead and look at our attributes for myself and Jason, right? So let me go ahead and look at for myself here. And you can see these attributes again get synced from Active Directory. And my country location is US. Whereas for Jason, his attribute location is UK. So now, depending on their country location, the data gets filtered, right? So if I go into the policy of what that policy definition looks like, is in here, I am saying to filter that country based on the user's country attribute. So depending on what their country location is at the runtime, this filter will be applied. So what happens is if a user changes their country location, that will get synced from Active Directory into Privacera, and then we will automatically update the policy in Dremio. So when I go ahead and save that policy, again, the red dot changes to blue. That's how I know that the policy is enabled and being enforced in Dremio. If I go back to my query, earlier you can see I have 10 rows and I can see both US and UK country for myself. If I go ahead and run the query now, I only see the US data. Again, that was kind of my country location. And now if I run it for Jason, again, he was able to see US and UK before, but now when I run it, the expectation is he should only see UK. Here the query is running, here you go. And you can see that he only sees, so that filter is basically being applied on runtime. That's all I wanted to demonstrate here. Thank you.
Hey, Lovelace, that was awesome. I'm super excited about this. When we talk about being able to provide access controls and really, be very granular with, column and row to the broader organization, this is super powerful. I'm super excited that this is a relatively new feature that Privacera just released with Policy Sync as well. So I highly encourage everyone today to try it for themselves, to go ahead and sign up for Dremio Cloud. We have a free for life version of Dremio Cloud that you can sign up for, and you can start to get started with your open data lakehouse. And then you can sign up for Privacera as well and start adding those access control policies, start empowering your users to access the data about the right data that they're supposed to be able to see within Dremio. So I really do appreciate everyone attending today. Loveless and Privacera, I appreciate your partnership and for participating in this webinar. And we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions if anyone has any questions for the team. Right. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. We are going to open up for some Q&A. Loveless, that was an awesome demo. I really do appreciate it. I'm super excited. We do have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is, how do you enforce policies in SQL coming to Dremio directly? Are you somehow in the loop? Example, how do you add masking to the query? I think you covered this a little bit in the demo, but if you could just double click into that a little bit more.
Yeah, so as you saw in the demo, you basically get the Privacera UI to create that policy. And then once the policy gets created in Privacera, the policy sync engine kind of calculates the delta, right? So it knows basically all the policies that exist in Dremio right now and what is in Privacera. And then it will translate that policy into SQL and push that into Dremio. So that's how the policy gets pushed into Dremio. And then once you're running the query, the masking or the row level filtering gets applied. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think just to double click on that, on the demo itself, you showed having two different columns, right? Or a column with two different variables, UK and US. But just to make sure, the question is, was that a column in the table?
Yeah, so what I showcased there was I had a country column within that table, which has different values. And the use case is where you want to filter out that table depending on who is the user who is querying that data set. So as myself, I showed my attribute value for that country was US. And then for Jason, his value was UK. And then basically I had that filtered where a country was being filtered depending on the user's country location. And that was basically being applied when the policy was pushed.
Awesome. Thank you. I do encourage anyone else who has any additional questions, you can go ahead and throw it into the Q&A feature here in Zoom. I do have a question for you. Just this integration between Privacera and Dremio. Can you talk about just kind of where that's available today with what Privacera products and with what Dremio products?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Brett, I think the best way for our audience to try that would be the SaaS offering, right? So Privacera has a SaaS offering where you can go on privaceracloud.com and register for an account. Once the account is approved, you'll receive an email, and then you can basically connect on the SaaS, as I was showing in the demo, that you have a lot of different connectors. So you have a connector for Dremio, where you can integrate with your Dremio service. You'll basically be doing the JDBC connection between Privacera and Dremio. And then once you do that, then you'll be able to start authoring policies and enforcing policies on your Dremio side.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, I think that's definitely the best way to do it on the Dremio side as well with Dremio Cloud. We do have a question in the Q&A now. The space where you were demoing policy changes seem to be Dremio specific, right? The policies you set in Privacera were being applied into Dremio and the data that is being queried in Dremio. But can you define a policy once in Privacera that's enforced across multiple query engines, multiple clouds, multiple sources, so like Dremio, Databricks, et cetera? Is that something that you can do, and how would you integrate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way we do it, so what I did showcase on demo was what we call our resource policies, and those policies are specific to a resource, right? So when I created that policy, I was creating it specifically for Dremio. We have a concept of what we call attribute-based policies, or the tag policies specifically, and those are global in nature. So for example, if I have, in that case, I'll create a policy, and I can actually showcase that. I think it'll be helpful if I share my screen here and kind of do a quick preview of that. Are you able to see my screen?
Yep,
Yeah. So as I was showing resource policies, we have the concept of what we call the tag policies. And these are more global in nature. So when I define a tag policy in here, for example, in here, I'm defining the policy on a specific tag, like the email tag. So you can see in here, I'm not defining the policy at a virtual space or a store or anything like that. So any data that's tagged as email, no matter where it sits, this one policy will apply, right? And then at the bottom, when I basically are choosing my group or user, I can choose the services in here, right? So I can easily basically add Dremio in here and then provide kind of what permission I want to allow or deny, right? So that's how that policy would look like. So this one policy will govern access across all these services. So for example, S3, ADLS, and GCS, and then Snowflake and Dremio. I hope that makes sense.
It does. No, that's awesome. Thank you very much. So I think that's all the questions that we had in the Q&A. I do want to thank everybody for joining today and being a part of this. I'm super excited about this integration and this partnership. I hope you all are as well. And I do encourage you all to try Dremio and Privacera and try it out for yourself. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Brett.